After World War I, Los Angeles was a mecca for people of all backgrounds. People came in droves to take advantage of benefits such as warm weather and better job opportunities. Black Americans were especially drawn to Los Angeles because it represented freedom from difficult conditions that many of them experienced in the southern United States. Although conditions were greatly improved from the conditions that they had faced in the South, many Black Americans still faced difficulties such as substandard housing and police brutality. Blacks in Los Angeles began to voice their frustrations around the time that civil rights movements around the country erupted. Watts riots of 1965 took place in a sector of Los Angeles called Watts, which was inhabited by mostly lower-class people of color. On August 11, 1965, a young black man by the name of Marquette Fry was arrested by white police officers on suspicion of drunk driving. Fry was arrested less than a block away from his mother's home. The officers brutally beat and injured Fry when he resisted arrest, using far more violence than was necessary. This instance of police brutality sparked blacks in the neighborhood to begin looting, burning, and destroying their own property in anger over the injustices they faced. After 6 days of rioting, 34 people had died, over 1,000 people were injured, and nearly 4,000 blacks had been arrested.
As we sat there quietly in the dark, I began to be frightened. We were very rarely asked to be quiet. In fact, one of the wonderful things about living with both my mother and my grandmother, as we did, was that we played them off both against each other. And my grandmother was someone who always allowed us to play raucously and loudly. And yet that night we had to sit quietly and really not even move. And as we sat there, I began to hear sirens in the distance. And once those sirens started up, it seemed as if they never stopped.
While police brutality was one cause of the riot, blacks were also upset about poor housing available to them and unjust opportunities in education and careers. In the Watts riots, Black Americans took a stand in history by protesting the lack of job opportunities, poor quality housing, insufficient education, and police brutality. In the 1960s, most jobs that were available to black people in Los Angeles were jobs with low pay, poor working conditions, and people were often fired without notice. In addition, few jobs were available to blacks that were unemployed. Martin Luther King said of the Watts riots, "Unless some work can be found for the unemployed and underemployed, we continually face the possibility of this kind of outbreak at every encounter with police authority." In a 1965 press conference, Ronald Reagan gave his thoughts on the causes of the Watts riots.
Many of our people there are recent immigrants from remote and rural areas. They came to Los Angeles believing the streets were paved with gold. They'd heard promises. Many of them illiterate, and the promises didn't materialize. And then the poverty program made a promise, a youth program for that particular area. And this was to involve summer camps and so forth, and all summer long, the promise kept on while people at every level of politics in California argued over who was going to be in charge and pull the strings with regard to the program, and by August it became apparent they couldn't resolve the argument there was going to be no program. And this was a very frustrating experience, and I'm sure had something to do with what went on.
Another reason many people took part in the Watts riots was to protest the poor quality housing available to African Americans. Many of the homes available to blacks in Los Angeles during this time were dilapidated, and white landowners were unwilling to make repairs. Blacks were often restricted from buying or renting houses in better conditions located in white neighborhoods. Frame houses that were built as single-family homes are often subdivided by absentee landlords and rented to several families. The buildings are allowed to deteriorate until condemned by the health department. The rickety structures are then torn down and sold.
Around the time of the riots, my family and I lived in a section of Los Angeles called Mid-City. This was a really big deal for us because for most of the time that both my mother and my father's family had been in Los Angeles, getting back to the late 1800s, we had lived on the east side of Los Angeles. And in fact, most people of color lived on the east side. Relatively few black people ventured out of those neighborhoods. However, after World War II, and certainly as it got into the 50s, people began to move farther to the west and more to the center and south of the city.
I lived on a street called Ruth Dillon, which is considered the west side. It's not considered Watts. At that time, it was still a pretty good area to be in, but it was on the west side.
The reason many rioters protested was for better education. Schools were segregated during this time, and black schools were often underfunded and had few resources to teach children sufficiently. At least 13 of the elementary schools in Los Angeles do not have cafeterias because the pupils cannot afford to eat in such places. The Parent-Teacher Association provides 1,300 free lunches a day in the school district, but these are not available in schools that have no cafeterias. Yet it is here that the need is most desperate.
A lot of the kids in certain areas had never been no more than 5 miles away from their home, their whole life. Their whole environment, their whole life experience has been right in their immediate community. So, when you're not exposed to better, you don't really have the aspiration to do better because you accept it. You think that this is the way it is. And unless somebody reaches out to you and, pulls you forward, a lot of them just don't do well.
Perhaps one of the largest reasons for rioting was due to the immense amount of police brutality going on in Los Angeles at this time. White police officers would use unnecessary force on black people who were being arrested. This spurred a lot of anger towards white police officers, which eventually caused the riots after the arrest of Marquette Frye. The Watts riots yielded few immediate changes in the lives of African Americans. For example, in the decades following the riots, there remained a significant gap between white and black income. However, the Watts riots inspired people to take a historical stand against social injustice. It also influenced several other racial riots that brought attention to racial inequality. Examples of these are Cleveland's Huff Riot in 1966, the Newark Riot in 1967, and the Detroit Riot of 1967. Most directly, the Watts riots influenced the Rodney King riots of 1992 in Los Angeles. While some people believe that the Watts riots changed conditions for African Americans in Los Angeles, other people believed that the riots did nothing to help at all.
I think riots to me are useless in the sense that they do express your frustration, but from what I've seen of the different riots and like the Rodney King riot, they tear up their own community, and what the people that are involved in rioting, they don't seem to get it that really the powers that be don't care about you tearing up your own neighborhood.